Wave management is foundational to your success as a laner and becomes more and more integral to your continued growth as you climb the ranks. This video will walk through the general principles of wave management, as well as common wave management strategies to help grasp this complicated aspect of the game. What are the goals for wave management? Simply put, they are to maximize your CS, minimize your opponent's CS, not die to ganks, gank the enemy when appropriate, when to recall, and pressure. League is a team game, and for the most part I will be discussing how to build yourself an advantage, but you can always translate your advantageous lane state into something beneficial to your team. That is what pressure is referring to. Dragons, invading, diving side lanes, all come from the pressure that you put in your lane to allow for those possibilities. Mostly, I'm going to talk about CS and recalling as they're the most pertinent for the purposes of proper wave management. Before we get to that, however, we need to understand and be comfortable with a few general concepts, some of which you may already know. Starting off, the same number of creeps on each side will usually result in an even lane state, only when the wave is in the direct middle of the lane. In other words, if the melee minions start hitting each other closer to one side's turret, the lane will naturally push in the other direction. This is because the next wave arrives earlier due to the minions being closer. Waves will naturally bounce back and forth until a turret dies unless it gets frozen. What does it mean to have a frozen lane? A frozen lane is when one player prevents the wave from bouncing by tanking or kiting the creeps. You can permanently freeze the lane by tanking enough creeps to leave the same number of, or more, creeps alive after the wave has been killed. You can always decide to stop tanking the creeps and let them crash a tower, which is why you should always attempt to set up a permanent freeze over a non-permanent one. Where you tank the creeps is important as well. You have to make sure the next enemy wave does not hit the tower, killing the creeps you're trying to freeze with and ruining the freeze. Melee creeps have more HP, less damage, and shorter range compared to caster creeps, and that makes them preferable to freeze with. If there are no enemies that will hinder your attempts at freezing, the easiest way to freeze is to tank the creeps on the opposing half of the lane. This simulates a neutral wave state, but with extra creeps, which reduces the chance creep RNG can ruin your freeze. I do this by running at the farthest piece of brush on either side, depending on which side is currently safer for me, timing it so that I lose minion aggro when my melee creeps would hit the center of the lane. The enemy laner being there doesn't change the mechanics about how freezing works, but does change the reasoning behind why you were trying to freeze. I'll go into more detail later in the video about why you would freeze with the enemy actually in lane, but for the purposes of setting up a freeze in the first place, all that matters is ensuring you have extra creeps held and the enemy wave not crashing into the tower. You can freeze with as few as 2 melee creeps, but I recommend having at least 3 or 4 to prevent any creep shenanigans ruining your permanent freeze. I want to stress that having more creeps makes it much easier to freeze. You will take extra damage every additional creep you add, but if you assess that the extra damage is negligent, keeping extra makes the freeze easier to execute. I'm going to introduce the concept of creep difference. Creep difference is a number calculated by subtracting the number of creeps your opponent misses on the recall by the number of creeps you miss. Basically, positive is good, negative is bad. 1 to 2 creeps doesn't really matter, but more than 3 is where advantages build from. How does this help, you might ask? Sometimes, the correct play for your wave looks very bad for you, and a less experienced player may try to avoid what they had done to get into that position. Consider the scenario where you lose an entire wave. That's bad, right? Probably, unless missing that wave made your opponent miss 2 waves. It's important to remember that League is versus an opponent, and whatever is good for them is bad for you, and vice versa. Not all minions are created equal, though. Cannons are about 2.25 times the value of a melee creep, and melees are about 1.75 times the value of a caster. This takes not just gold, but more importantly XP into account. Furthermore, the stats of the creeps are not all the same, and if you have a level lead on your opponents, your creeps will be stronger than the enemies. This makes freezing easier for the losing team, and neutral wave states also push towards the losing team. For the purposes of creep difference, take melee minions as the base unit. Next, we're going to talk about recalling. Why is recalling important when talking about wave management? Well, like when solving a maze, working backwards from the end can make it much easier to figure out how to find the correct path. In League terms, if you're trying to figure out what to do with the wave, thinking backwards from where you want to recall will guide you into making the correct wave decisions. When are you supposed to recall? Unfortunately, that is usually decided based on the matchup, but generally it's either when you're low on HP or low on mana, or you have an item, or you have a component, or there's like an objective coming soon. 90% of the time, it is correct for recalls in a game to be matched by your opponent, or vice versa. The reason for this is you don't want to be left with fewer resources in comparison to your opponent and be susceptible to getting trapped in lane. What does it mean to get trapped in lane? Getting trapped in lane is being in a wave or lane state where you are forced to lose 4+ creeps disadvantageously, or stay in lane. How is this done? For this explanation, we are going to assume the role of the person doing the trapping. Usually this happens when you are threatening to crash every wave, posturing that you will crash the wave should they base. If they don't recall, you crash the wave when it will bounce back towards you and turn it into a slow push. If the opponent were to base after catching the wave, this slow push is horrible for them. This heavily incentivizes the opponent into wanting to stay, otherwise they lose a ton of creeps and thus they feel trapped. What do you do if you get trapped in lane? The most important thing is recognizing it early and, if possible, call your jungler to help bail you out. If that isn't possible, you have to just bite the bullet and base. The reason is that consecutively bleeding out creeps for 4 waves is far worse than losing the entire first wave and then laning normally afterwards. Anyways, back to recalling. It takes approximately 35 to 40 seconds to get back to lane after killing the last creep before a recall. This is due to the time it takes to walk to a safe place to base, regen, and then walk back. Envisioning what the wave will look like by the time you get back into XP range, as well as calculating the creep difference, is the fundamental concept behind getting a good recall off.
But wait!
I hear you literally screaming at the top of your lungs.
What about teleport? It drastically reduces the time it takes to get back to lane, making it very difficult to punish or be punished when it's up.
Excellent question, person I made up. Teleport indeed makes laning much safer and is the reason why a lot of pros opt for it. The short answer is, in order to punish someone in lane with wave manipulation, you need to force their TP. How do you do that? Well, if you both have TP, the most common way is to trade them on a recall. If you have TP advantage, the best thing you can do is abuse the fact that your recall is so quick and base TP back without giving them the time to fully crash the next wave or satisfactorily base themselves, allowing you to freeze the wave or trap them in lane. If you have TP disadvantage, you have to be careful not to have that happen to you, and ideally set up the situation that would normally gain you creep advantage, but they can bail themselves out with TP. If you both have no TP, that is when wave manipulation starts to matter more than just the laning aspect. Let's give some examples. There are 3 common scenarios for basing. Remembering that 90% of the time you base in close succession with your opponent. If the wave is neutral, you and your opponent will always be within 1 to 2 creeps of each other, and it's generally acceptable for both players. The other 2 scenarios are after the wave has been crashed. Either you crash the wave or your opponent crashes the wave. If you properly crash the wave, it will either reset to neutral or it will be pushing to you. Keyword properly, as a properly crashed wave has the casters in range of the turret, and an improperly crashed wave is also known as a frozen wave and would be very bad to recall on. If your opponent is able to kill the next wave quickly enough, perhaps due to the turret, then you may end up losing more than they do. Although if they are a bit too slow, then you can freeze the wave, which is very good. What this tells you is that every second counts on a recall. On the flip side, what are you supposed to do if you know you can't kill the wave before your opponent gets back to lane and freezes it without using your jungler or support? This is extremely important to know, and even challenger players don't always do this. The best thing you can do is, instead of crashing only 1 wave, crash 2. Specifically, after the crashed wave, the next wave you slow push, and the next wave after that, you fast push. Let's look at an example. The 5th wave has just arrived, and LeBlanc decides to fast push the wave and base. This is going to leave Akali in an uncomfortable situation. Akali can't try to freeze this because she's too low for how big of a wave this is. She tries to bail herself out by canceling LeBlanc's recall, but LeBlanc is smart and based out of vision. Akali also knows that the next wave is a cannon and will be very hard to push fast enough before LeBlanc can set up a freeze. This is where the slow push, fast push wave manipulation comes into play. After last hitting the last few creeps, notice how Akali is not panicking and futilely trying to push despite it being a cannon wave. Even when a creep dies to the tower, she still plays it safe because the possibility of getting frozen on is huge. She patiently last hits, knowing the wave is building, and waits for the next wave before trying to shove. LeBlanc comes back to lane, and this is where you will have to be brave and abuse your huge minion wave advantage. LeBlanc tries to poke and harass Akali as much as she can, while Akali is solely focused on clearing the next wave as efficiently as possible. Assuming you don't die to one combo, you can usually clear this next wave, and the sheer number of creeps alive prevents the enemy from trying to freeze. This is a textbook example of how a slow push into fast push can save you. If they have teleport, they may be able to prevent you from stacking 2 waves to crash and therefore may not work. If that is the case, the best thing at that point is either basing after the crash wave dies or basing after killing the 3 melees on the wave after that. You may be wondering why I haven't mentioned cannons, and that is because knowing those 3 scenarios without the influence of cannons is vital, and looking how they were altered on cannon waves is a crucial distinction. So how do things change? The neutral scenario does not change. In the scenarios where you crash the wave, however, which wave is the cannon will significantly change the outcome of the scenario. If the first wave is the cannon, the second wave will usually crash under the tower due to how long it takes to push cannons, making it more likely to lose some creeps walking back to lane. Most people, though, recall the wave before the cannon due to how long it takes to kill them and the fact that they tank a lot of turret shots. If this second wave is the cannon, this is the key reason why you must know and execute the slow push strategy. Killing cannons takes a super long time, but when they're alive, they destroy creep waves and allow you to safely push that third wave and then base. If the third wave is the cannon, it actually makes the slow push pretty bad because it's hard to kill the next wave without the enemy trimming yours enough to freeze it. In this case, it's often best to just take the base after the first wave dies, or the second wave first 3 melee creeps and then lose the caster creeps and maybe a few melees. Now it is possible to use the information I've given to derive the strategies yourself, but as wave management and matchups go hand in hand, it might not be clear exactly what you should try to do. Therefore, I'm going to give a simplified guide of how you should be playing the lane phase in general in any situation. Conceptually, you should always be playing either aggressively or defensively. If you aren't sure which, try to be aggressive as it is the more testing approach to face. Not everything is going to be related to wave management, but I'm going to go through them all. Starting with being aggressive, if you want to dive your laner, ideally, you have as big of a wave as possible to dive with. This means you slow push the waves before you're going to dive, and on the wave you're going to dive, you fast push. If you want to poke them under tower and take plates, you do the same thing as threatening a dive. Stack as big a wave as possible and fast push the wave you're actually going to crash. Sun Tzu said, pretend to be weak when you're strong and pretend to be strong when you're weak. In line with that, you can pretend to be scared when you think your opponent will all in you and kill them with your jungler nearby. Similarly, you can also force the situation by taking a losing all-in with your jungler nearby and gank them in that way. More aggressive lines are fast pushing the wave if you want to roam or get vision or get an objective. Pushing for level advantage is pivotal early but becomes less and less important as the game progresses. Finally, you can freeze in front of your own tower with the intention of denying CS and forcing them to be gankable. On the defensive side of things, fast clearing the wave minimizes the time in lane, which also minimizes the damage from an opponent. Do this when you hard lose trades or you need to base and can clear the wave quickly and safely. You can also save clear when the wave is pushing to you and it's hard for your opponent to walk into your range without taking free damage. Ideally, you don't miss any CS doing this and take no damage. A slow push into fast clear to prevent the freeze we talked a lot about in regards to recalling, but even when you aren't, it's still a good defensive option to remember. This is perfect for when you're gankable and want to reset the lane to neutral. Often in melee versus ranged matchups, you have to trade HP for last hits. Doing this efficiently is a defensive playstyle and required to make a lot of melee mids work. You can always have your jungler bail you out if you need help to push out to prevent a freeze, but be careful because the enemy also has a jungler. Sharing XP is totally okay, it's more important to prevent the freeze. Freezing in front of your own tower is also a defensive option, and you do it for a completely different reason. The lane is in the safest spot for you, assuming you can't get dove, and you can easily translate the freeze into a slow push, fast push recall. If freezing is both a defensive and offensive lane state, is it bad to always try and freeze the lane? Short answer, yes, but there's a lot of nuance as to why. Not every champ and matchup freezing is actually sensible in, and it's important to consider that while it can be used aggressively, it isn't the most punishing of lane states. What's worse, getting dove or bleeding 10 CS of gold over 2 minutes? Not to mention, if your jungler has something bad happen, they are not going to be happy with you freezing your lane instead of doing literally anything else. I want to note the distinction between freezing for lane advantages and freezing on a recall. They use the same name and strategy, but for different purposes. I note this because I want to talk about bad freezes on a recall. What are those? A bad freeze is one that may look good in the short term, but is actually creep negative in the long run. The principal scenario is the opponent is freezing too big of a wave and cannot punish you if you stay to push the next wave as well, or they take so much damage freezing that you can force them to take a bad base once you come back to lane. Remember when I was talking about missing an entire wave being bad, but if your opponent misses 2, it's actually good? Every single one of you thought, this scenario was stupid, that never happens. When in fact it happens every single time someone freezes a wave at a bad time. It's important to remember that wave management isn't about removing your losses in their entirety, it's about playing in the way that maximizes your relative strength in comparison to your opponent and gives your team the best chance to win. I touched on it earlier, but in the early lane phase, the priorities are very different. The only thing that matters is level advantage. It is important to know when you are strong and what levels are important in your matchup in order to play your lane around getting the important level first. This results in both sides trying to push or planning on pushing on the bounce at the correct time. It's also important to be trading when you have these short level advantage windows. Pre-level 6, level advantage is what you should be playing for 90% of the time. Finally, the last thing we need to go over is what to do when you kill your opponent. Properly playing the waves pulls from a ton of different areas that we have discussed earlier in the video, so let's go through it step by step. As soon as you kill your opponent, you have about 30 seconds with no TP before they come back to lane. There are 4 options for what you can do, and for each, you need to envision what they're going to look like 30 to 50 seconds into the future. Additionally, you need to consider TP, jungler support influence, and freezing for all of them. If your wave is already slow pushing to you, or it's neutral, you can base immediately without hitting any creeps and it will be good. Remember that junglers can push the wave for their mid laners though, so keep that in mind. You can also kill enough creeps or pull the wave so that it's either freezing or slow pushing or neutral and then base. You can clear the entire wave so it crashes then base, or have it slowly push out. Depending on the situation, different plays become better. You don't have to be as stubborn about getting a good recall because you just got a kill, so keep that in mind. Creep difference, what creeps are alive, creep positioning, jungle support positioning, potential freezes, and most importantly, not getting trapped are all very important to consider post-kill in lane. Having your jungler help you push is always good unless you didn't need to push the wave in the first place. And that's everything. Keep in mind that this is a simplified version of wave management. There are so many variables that go into it, it would be impossible to adequately talk about them all. So hopefully this is a good guideline to follow as you get more and more comfortable with waves. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.